Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the webinar on impact investing opportunities in the Pacific. Good morning to everyone that's in Asia today, and to all of those who are logging in from Australia and the Pacific, good afternoon, and to those of you that are in North America, good evening. My name is Pranay Sampson, and I'm the Associate Director of Impact Partners at IIX. IIX is a global organization dedicated to building a more inclusive world as the foundation for sustainable peace. We connect the back streets of underserved communities to the wall streets of the world by changing financial systems for women empowerment, climate action, and community resilience. Today, we're delighted to partner with Pacific Rise, an initiative funded by the Australian government, for an exciting discussion of impact investment opportunities in the Pacific. The Pacific region is home to some of the world's most unique ecologies, under threat from the rising pressures of climate change. In recent years, the Pacific economies have been experiencing steady growth, with exports continuing to accelerate the growth. While there's much economic promise in the region, the Pacific continues to be ranked amongst the world's worst for women's economic opportunities, regardless of women actually being responsible and deeply involved in the majority of food production, as well as micro-enterprises and market activity. So today, we will be discussing impact investment opportunities in the Pacific that deliver not only promising economic returns, but also investments that shift the needle on gender equality in the Pacific Islands, as well as unlocking further economic growth. Joining me today, I'd like to introduce the three speakers for today, Amanda Jupp, Natasha Garza, and Liata Alameona Roberts. Amanda Jupp is the facility manager of Pacific Rise, a social enterprise investment readiness initiative managed by Coffee, a Tetra Tech company, on behalf of the Australian government. Amanda has over 15 years of professional experience in managing complex international development programs, specializing in impact investment, fund management, public health, and governance, including 5 years in-country experience in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Natasha Garza is the Associate Director of Innovative Finance and co-lead of Gender Expertise in IIX. In this role, she focuses on the Women's Livelihood Bond Series, impact measurement, and other gender lens investing initiatives. Prior to joining IIX, Natasha has a decade of experience in international development and finance, including founding a nonprofit called Shades of Happiness, as well as working with D.E. Shaw, a New York-based hedge fund. Liata Alameona Roberts is the Impact Investment Manager for Pacific Trade and Invest in Australia, the trade and investment arm for 16 Pacific Islands. This role facilitates impact investing to enable enterprises and small businesses to become commercially sustainable and provide positive social outcomes in their villages and communities. Liata brings a broad range of experience in working in developing countries, particularly in the areas of trade, investment, and aviation, and is now following her passion in bringing this to the Pacific. Amanda, Natasha, Liata, thank you very much for joining us this morning. And it's unique really to have three different voices at the table to discuss this topic. So I'd like to allow each of you to sort of introduce yourself in a little bit more detail. Amanda, if you'd like to start.
Pranay, thank you very much for that introduction, and also thank you to the IIX team for arranging this webinar. I would like to introduce Pacific Rise, which is the program that I work with. So Pacific Rise is the Pacific Readiness for Investment in Social Enterprise, which is why we call it Pacific Rise. And it's an initiative of the Australian government and funded through Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Pacific Rise was established to demonstrate impact investments in different countries in the Pacific, to deepen the knowledge about the investment process and the Pacific ecosystem. We partner with specialists like your team at IIX to fund the investment readiness capacity building and to engage with investors, such as through this webinar. Pacific Rise also partners with Pacific Trade Invest Australia, which is Liata and her team, as well as with the US-based gender lens investing experts and think tank, the Criterion Institute. So we use a gender lens on investment across the program, which is why we work with organisations with the strong gender skills like IIX. We also support impact investment intermediaries and investors to understand gender lens investing, to access gender experts and research and data to inform the investment process alongside financial analysis. This results in better investments that take into account risk, but can also create opportunities to improve economic and social outcomes for women and girls. So on the next slide, I just have a little bit about how we facilitate those investments. So Pacific Rise provides grant funding for intermediaries to explore social impact areas within the Pacific and to find investment opportunities. It introduces investors and intermediaries to businesses and gender networks within the Pacific. And as we learn, we also adapt how we work. So we're developing new tools and research based on what we've learned to support that investment readiness process. For example, we're working on a tool to help integrate gender-based violence into an investor's due diligence process. And as another example, we're also conducting research into legal and regulatory frameworks in the Pacific and working with Pacific experts to help intermediaries navigate that investment environment. We also engage directly with investors, and to do this, we developed a Pacific investment thesis that identifies 6 future trends in the Pacific and opportunities to invest today to take advantage of those futures. This includes climate change adaptation, high quality value chains, informal economy, domestic industry, technology, and transportation. So our partner at the Criterion Institute leads this work with the investors and to influence how investment can be used for women's economic empowerment and into areas where women can benefit. So that's just a bit of an introduction to Pacific Rise.
Thank you, Amanda. It's truly inspiring to see the advancements in the social enterprise ecosystem in the Pacific that's being made with your support. And we really also deeply respect the gender lens that you apply throughout your work. IX closely shares this belief with Pacific Rise, and I'm pleased to introduce one of my colleagues, Natasha Garza, who can tell you a little bit more about IX's approach in this regard. Natasha, over to you.
Thank you, Pranay, and thank you, Amanda, for that wonderful introduction. I think whenever I'm also just very excited to be on this panel because we have 3 women talking about investments and about empowering other women in a geography that very few organizations in the impact investing and sustainable development space have yet to explore. So Pacific Rise is truly a pioneer in this respect, and I believe it is a very brave and important program as the world becomes both smaller and needs to think more expansively about what gender lens investing means. As an organization, we do connect the back streets of underserved communities with the Wall Streets of the world. And I think this has got particular importance in the Pacific because as we focus on women, community, and climate, we see they're all deeply linked in the context of the Pacific. You cannot have a resilient community if you don't have women as a part of the solutions you're building. And you cannot have climate adaptation if women aren't integrated into thinking about how we create a stronger economy, both from a climate mitigation perspective through clean energy and through an adaptation perspective to sustainable agriculture, which we'll talk more about as we move on. As an organization, we've spent the last decade really building the impact investment ecosystem in Asia and have now progressed to have work all the way in the West from the United States to the Far East in Fiji, actually. So it's very, very exciting for us to see this global expansion and really bringing the world together through our work. We've mobilized over $75 million to build a more peaceful and inclusive world. We've impacted 23 million lives with a big commitment to measure and value impact. So we don't just mobilize capital, we actually measure the social outcomes that are achieved as well. And then we've created an ecosystem in over 40 countries. And we are very excited about doing more, particularly in the Pacific. As an organization, we work across the social capital markets value chain, which means we do accelerators for very early stage organizations. We have an equity crowdfunding platform for early to growth stage organizations to shift them up. And then we have our bond program, which I'll talk about in a moment. So it's really working across this spectrum, and we're very excited to build this out in the Pacific. We've already done some of this work in the Pacific. So we've started off actually a number of years ago, working with the Environmental Defense Fund. As many of you know, the Pacific is a blue economy, and we had done a number of projects which focused on sustainable fisheries, which we think is a very integral part of the Pacific economy. We also then had the pleasure of partnering with Pacific Trade and Invest, looking to see how we can work towards mobilizing more investments for Fiji in particular. So Pacific Trade and Invest, I would have to say, has been a truly excellent partner in this capacity with the deep, I would say, knowledge. And I'm very excited that Liata is a part of this conversation, and deep networks on how you actually bring in outside investments into the Pacific and how you also catalyze local investments. So very important work that they're doing, and we're excited to be partnering with them. And finally, as I mentioned before, the pioneering program that Kofi and DFAT are doing with Pacific Rise, which brings me to a very important point of the fact that we need to focus more on gender lens investing when we think about the Pacific, because women do have a very big role to play on the future trajectory, both from an economic development point of view and from a social progress point of view. As an organization, IIX is woman-led. We have a majority of women employees, as you will see. And I think that really has governed on how we approach these investments decisions as well. Gender lens investing for us is not having a woman on the board of an entity that we raise capital for. It's very much integrated in the process of how we even evaluate an investment opportunity, how we present that from a risk return and impact perspective to our investors, and how we make decisions along the way to magnify the impact on the millions of women who are currently excluded from the financial ecosystem. One of the ways we do this is we ensure women have a voice and are given a value. And we do this through our impact measurement, which focuses on measuring the outcomes in a very forward-looking way and looking at the capital. And finally, we also develop innovative financial products. Many times you'll see that a lot of people who talk about the gender lens investing space will either say on the supply side that there are not enough investors with an appetite for gender lens investing, and on the demand side, you'll hear social enterprises saying that there's not enough pipeline. Since we sit in the middle of this ecosystem and have done so for over a decade, we believe it's a lack of innovative products that can link supply and demand. That's the real issue that we need to address. Our Women's Livelihood Bond series seeks to do just that. In 700 years of capital markets, this was the first time that we issued a bond last year that's listed on a stock exchange and that's focused exclusively on women. So the $8 million pilot Women's Livelihood Bond was the first time you have something in the world that's quoted on Bloomberg that talks about women empowerment, that gives investors a 5.65% coupon, while also impacting 385,000 women in Asia. And the most exciting part of this is that we're now looking to replicate this instrument with a $100 million issuance that will now look more globally. And we're very excited to say that we're also looking to see if we can include entities from the Pacific with a gender lens in the next series. And also just a quick shout out to DFAT for their support in the first bond, helping us subsidize the cost of the guarantee. I think it's also important to say that everybody has a role to play in gender lens investment. This is not just about social enterprises and investors. It's also about the way that public sector funding can come in to de-risk these investments, and the way philanthropic funding can come in to help actually create these new and innovative products. So everyone has a role to play, and we're very excited to be doing more of these products in the Pacific.
Thank you, Natasha. That was great. And I'd now like to, last but not least, invite Liata to tell us a little bit more about the work that she and her team have been doing, which has been absolutely wonderful in building up the marketplace for Pacific enterprises, particularly with regards to impact investment and the work of Pacific Raised Invest Australia. Liata, over to you.
Thanks, Pranay. Talofa lava and hello. Thanks, IIX, for the opportunity to sit on this panel. It's very exciting to be a part of it with my fellow colleagues. And also thank you for those who have tuned in to hear a bit more about the opportunities impact investment in the Pacific region. Just by way of background, with Pacific Trade Invest Australia, we're the lead trade and investment agency for the 16 Pacific Islands, including Fiji, Samoa, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and PNG, to name a few. The four pillars that we work under are export, tourism, creative industries, and investment. And I guess with the growth in impact investment globally is recognized that it's a really good fit for the Pacific in this impact investment space. I think social impact is something that has come quite naturally to Pacific Islanders. It's been there for a long time. It's just a shift now where enterprises, entrepreneurs, and businesses are now forming, businesses to be able to further the social impact work, and proving too that the notion of being able to do good and still make money and working in. So we're seeing that there is a bit more interest, there's a bit more work, and that's a space that we really want to continue growing. And I'll just shift to that next slide where under that investment banner, we're really putting that focus on impact investments. So together with our partners, Pacific Rise and intermediaries such as IIX, we're really driving forward to try and attract more of that sort of impact investment into the Pacific. We know it can work. It's been proven with projects such as Tana Coffee that we did in Vanuatu, where there was impact investment that went in and through it enabled social impact for coffee farmers on Tana Island, and also in a coconut cluster group in Samoa, supporting coconut farmers in that space, empowering the Pacific Islanders, and in turn creating better livelihoods, increasing their economic development, helping eliminate poverty across that space. And I'm really excited for Pranay to highlight too that we've been working on in Fiji, and yeah, really looking forward to getting that. The role that we play here at PTIA and Impact Investment is really as a facilitator. We spend quite a lot of time in country scoping for suitable enterprises for impact investment. Now we find them at different stages, whether they are closer to being investment ready or very new with potential, and that's where we facilitate and introduce them into intermediaries such as IIX and work closely with Pacific Rise to do that investment readiness work, to be able to then bring them up to the stage where they'll be ready to be introduced or facilitate introductions into impact investors. So we see us working and playing out that part in the ecosystem, and we're seeing quite a lot more coming up through the pipeline. So there's never really been a better time to consider or have a look at impact investing in this space. So I'm really looking forward to discussing it more over during this panel. And also, if you want to get in touch with me later, my contact details will be made available as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Leata. That was lovely, and thank you very much for also segueing into what I will be talking about today. So IIX has actually also been able to work with the Pacific Rise program and PTI on two specific opportunities, an extension of our work in Southeast Asia, really also focusing on the sustainable agricultural value chain. I lead the Impact Partners platform at IIX, where we connect investors to impact investment opportunities. We have over 1,000 investors registered on the platform, and that represents over $10 billion US in assets. So it represents a tremendous opportunity. And in a sense, I think bringing opportunities like the two that we're going to talk about today is the kind of work that IIX has been focused on doing over the last decade. We've been able to work with these two organizations in terms of investment readiness and getting them ready to talk to investors and helping to build out the business plans for each of the companies to really grow them to the next level. But the great thing is that they really bring to the table already a deep gender lens focus in terms of building out their businesses. So I'd like to first introduce the first company that we'd like to talk about today, which is a group called Bula Coffee. Bula Coffee is absolutely fascinating because coffee as a commodity is something that we all associate with in our day-to-day lives. Yet in Fiji, this is an industry which doesn't exist. There is no local coffee available other than Bula Coffee. And the interesting thing is Bula Coffee actually happened to find this in the wild. So it is really wild coffee that is growing in Fiji because of the nature of the soil and the climate. Coffee has been able to grow here naturally. And as a result, Bula has been able to work very closely with very remote villages, giving them livelihood opportunities in picking coffee, processing the coffee, and then moving it either to the domestic market or to export markets such as New Zealand and Australia. So really through this process, they are providing opportunities for employment in rural communities, meaning that migration to cities or to work in the tourism industry is actually slowing down to an extent. And as a result, farmers that actually have an alternative opportunity in the down season. The other interesting thing about coffee picking is it typically happens in a non-seasonal way with the other agricultural products that exist in Fiji. So Bula Coffee is really interesting from the perspective that this also allows women who are otherwise at home to get opportunities for income. They work on educating women in terms of how to receive income for the first time, helping them open bank accounts and helping them understand what it means to sort of manage money for the first time, and really also allow them to connect as a community. Typically, the wild coffee that grows is also outside of the village. So women from the village move from the village to the area where wild coffee exists to process and pick the wild coffee outside of the village as groups. So it also really connects the village community as well, very much building into Fijian culture. So specifically, why this is a fantastic growth opportunity is Bula intends to use an investment of $570,000 to double their village network, to increase their production capacity by 4 times, as well as to set up a plantation and nursery. The interesting thing about wild coffee, while it is, while it's useful to have the ability to access wild coffee, it has not completely been mapped across the Fijian Islands. And at the same time, there are, to an extent, certain issues with demand and supply. So from a business perspective, they'd also like to set up a nursery and plantation and also to really expand the local Fijian coffee sector. As a result of this, we expect that 80% of the coffee pickers are women, and they will benefit with increased incomes of US dollars 1,200 per annum. So just to give you a context, a typical woman in Fiji, if she was earning minimum wage, would earn less than half of that. So this is a significant growth in terms of the level of income that they are able to receive. But on top of that, it's also the ability to manage this money that is coming to them for the first time in such large amounts. And on top of that, this is also a triple bottom line company, because this also has resulted in the local communities really continuing to value the forest as they do locally as a part of culture in any case, but also to really sustain the environmental health of the forest where wild coffee is growing. So a fantastic opportunity in terms of investment, and really brings impact investment to the fore as an opportunity. The second organization that I'd like to talk about today is also a really interesting organization from the context that there are rhizome-based crops that grow wild in Fiji as well, because the climate is so ideal for growing rhizome-based crops such as ginger and turmeric. As a result of this, Renandi plantation has been able to leverage this natural climate and soil conditions to be able to grow global GAP certified organic ginger and turmeric, and is really taking that to the export market from Fiji in a very systematic way, such that they can recognize increased price premiums, and that is able to be passed down to the local communities, not just through the people that they employ in their organic pack house, but also in terms of the farmer grower groups that they work to train and put together. So through these farmer grower groups, they continue to impart knowledge and training on sustainable farming practices. They support the grower groups on organic certification. They connect these grower groups through processing to international markets, and they pass on this additional value that is being created by connecting them to international markets by recognizing price premiums and being able to pay additional amounts for what they're purchasing from the grower groups. In terms of the investment that they're looking for, they're looking to really expand their ability to process more ginger and turmeric. These are commodities which have significant health benefits as well, and are continuing to be recognized by international export markets, particularly wild and organic certified ginger and turmeric are highly value-added products, which are used in a variety of beverages as well as ingredients for a number of baked goods and other value-added products. So through this investment, they will expect to expand their capacity over a period of time by 4 times. So they also work with, as I mentioned, farmer grower groups, of which 60% are women. And with this, we expect that they would be able to get an additional income of US $44,000. These are groups of between 4 to 10, typically farmers. Through this process, they are also focusing on rehabilitating and regenerating land, which has been previously, this is now land which will be organic certified for the first time and will therefore also be kept organic through traditional techniques. So if you'd like to learn about these opportunities in further detail, do ask questions after we're sort of done with the panel as a result of this, but also feel free to contact me after the panel discussion as well when we share our contact details. Bula and Renandi are really only a small taste of impact investment opportunities in the region, most of which are completely untapped. So at this time, I'd like to start the panel discussion for today. The first question that I'd like to ask more broadly, one of the taglines for Pacific Trade Invest Australia is that the Pacific represents an ocean of opportunity. I know that Australia has been looking at the Pacific in a big way, both in terms of foreign aid, but also as a strategic partner for the future. Amanda and Liata, if you'd like to in turn sort of describe the approach that you expect to take in terms of growing this in the future in the Pacific. Amanda, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Pranay. Absolutely. I think look, the Australian government has a lot of different types of investment in the Pacific. It goes much more beyond sort of the foreign aid that a lot of people talk about, but and Australia and other regional governments partner with the Pacific around security, trade, disaster response, building infrastructure. So there is a lot of capital flowing into the region, and this is an opportunity for investors to really look at the intention of that capital and to leverage off this. So I guess in terms of DFAT, and I guess why Pacific Rise exists, and Pacific Rise fits within a broad range of programs that the Australian government funds through the aid budget to support the Pacific private sector. Things like capacity building, supporting entrepreneurialism, market development activities. But a lot of this is grant facing. So, and grants aren't necessarily, the finance needs for business. So access to finance is a real challenge, particularly suitable capital for social enterprises and figures around the $250 to $1 million mark, but also smaller enterprises. Really, there's a big gap in capital for smaller enterprises and startup capital. So when we started out, we really looked at what is it about the Pacific that's really attractive for impact investment. And from a development perspective, I think, Pranay, we were having a discussion about your perspectives when you came back from Fiji. It's a different type of environment. A lot of people have access to land and resources. Land is very fertile and people have access to food. So people really can benefit when businesses or social enterprises grow. And in many Pacific Island cultures, wealth really is perceived as a collective possession. So, community is such a big focus. And if wealth is produced, it's expected to contribute to community. So a lot of the Pacific businesses we meet, they inherently have social intent, even if they don't necessarily identify as social enterprises. And Pacific countries have development needs, and they're taking a lot of steps to come in line and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, which is where impact investment, a lot of investors align their portfolio. So it's really possible, given the size of the country, while you might say population sizes are small, but an investment can have a really big impact from just one investment reaching across the size of the country. So that's really where we've seen these types of opportunities arise.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that too, and that was great, Amanda. Just add to that too, that it's just a different approach in that it's assisting and helping commercial entities or businesses and really helping entrepreneurs too to become more self-sustainable. But, you know, along with the other programs that are helping with capacity building and what, but it's actually, you know, business enabling. So impact investment goes into as business enabler to help them grow their business and still have and create those social impact opportunities where it's overcoming those challenges that we spoke about, you know, that's often coming up in terms of, you know, access to finance and whatnot that Amanda was speaking to. That's something that we're quite passionate about too, is helping the businesses become more commercially sustainable through impact investment, and also helping with that new next generations of entrepreneurs that are coming through too, because they're the ones that are innovative and will have that social impact flow and effect long way beyond aid and grants and so forth.
Thanks very much, Amanda and Liata. Those were absolutely great points, and I think we will sort of also talk through that a little bit more when we talk about the investment potential and opportunities. I'd just like to sort of also focus a little bit more on the gender lens aspect of what we were talking about. And Amanda, if I could just bring you in to also discuss, you know, how you see gender lens investing really moving the needle in the region, and why is it so important in the Pacific from your perspective?
Sure. So, as I said in the introduction, Pacific Rise has, uses a gender lens on investment to support finance intermediaries and investors, making sure that gender analysis is used alongside financial analysis when investing. So we're really looking at, what will it take to shift power dynamics within a sector or within a marketplace, and what is it that government or finance or investors can do to play a part in supporting those enterprises, social enterprises or businesses that are doing that. I guess within the Pacific, men and women play very different roles in the supply chain, and often that's dictated by traditional roles. Family businesses are really common. It's a very common type of enterprise. And as I was saying, wealth is expected to contribute to the community. So a lot of businesses have a sort of a social impact or a social intent. So we've found that using a gender lens is really important in this context, because it really assesses, I guess, who is impacted, who is working with that within that enterprise, and where are the opportunities. And we've found using it actually uncovers a lot of opportunities that you wouldn't necessarily see if you weren't looking that way. So we spent a lot of time with finance intermediaries, with investors, and they really do understand where a gender lens, where a gender analysis can come in. I mean, investors love data. This shows another way to look at where could potential risks be, where opportunities. And I guess, when we look at that, we see that social impact investment could come in to have a direct impact on women and girls. And there's a lot of capital out there wanting to have that impact. We've looked a lot at sectors like menstrual health or climate resilience, where, which will have a direct impact, or support to activities that address gender-based violence, which is one of the reasons why we're designing this due diligence tool that goes alongside an investor's usual due diligence process and says, okay, but what are also the aspects of that could be impacted by gender-based violence, but also investing in social enterprises, which the two organisations that you detailed earlier really they understand the impact they're having, and they create benefit for women in the supply chains and sectors like in agriculture, like coffee or vanilla or creative arts or community development and care, are areas of tremendous potential for women, and also the work that you're doing with the innovative finance around investing and many other, other investors want to come on and look at how can you aggregate and put something together in terms of finance in a bond structure that could make a big difference to women across the region.
Absolutely, Amanda. I couldn't agree with you more. I think that there is a huge movement towards looking at opportunities like this. And Natasha, if I could bring you in to describe some of IIX's experiences with this regard, in at least in Southeast Asia, but also now in the Pacific as well.
No, absolutely. And as I mentioned, we work in over 40 different countries, everywhere from the US to Fiji. So, and women empowerment has been something that we've been doing for over a decade. So this is not, the Gender Lens movement is in no way new to us. And we feel that it's been a core part of our DNA as an organization over this past decade, as in parallel, we've been building the impact investing ecosystem. So it's very much part of the way we approach our work and a fundamental pillar for us, as I mentioned before. When it comes to the Pacific in particular, I think it's an interesting point about the correlation between gender lens investing and women empowerment with climate change. So I do think as an organization, we have closed over 40 different deals in impact investing space on our equity crowdfunding platform alone, which has helped us mobilize millions of dollars, $75 million in total as an organization. And many of these deals have seen the correlation between women empowerment and climate, particularly since a number of them have been in clean energy and in sustainable agriculture. In the context of the Pacific, I think it's important to note that we're seeing that we are shifting the dynamic of viewing women as victims of climate change to recognizing that they can be solutions to climate action, particularly in the context of adaptation. Climate change is already a reality for the Pacific. This is already something that's happening, and we need everyone to be a part of the solution, and that includes half the population, which is women. Agriculture is one of the sectors, and that's why we actually focus on agriculture through our work with Pacific Rise. Is a wonderful way to include women as a part of the solution by working with entities like Bula and Renati, which have women integrated into the supply chain, giving women better livelihood opportunities, better ways to improve their demographic dividend, but also ways to improve food security for the region. We're also seeing a strong correlation in the fisheries sector. So climate change has a huge implication on ocean acidification. Coupled with illegal fishing, we're seeing depleting fishing stocks. Including women in the value chain, for instance, we worked with entities in our accelerator that we ran last year in the Pacific, in Fiji in particular, where we had entities that were having women doing the processing of these fish. So instead of having Fiji being a blue economy where you just catch the fish and then sell it to other economies to process it, we're capturing more value by having women actually working in the processing plants. This not only helps Fiji grow as an economy, but it also helps women improve their status within society, because now they're bringing in income. And this has huge implications on their ability to navigate the dynamics of gender-based violence. So we're seeing that all these things are very intricately linked. So you may look at climate change, but if you don't look at the context of women, you'll neither be able to solve the domestic violence issue nor the climate change issue, because you're excluding half the population. So we're very excited about doing more of this work in the Pacific, and bringing our expertise from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and further in the West to the Pacific as we move forward.
I think you brought up a key point, and really in terms of, I think how important sustainable agriculture is for the region. What it means in contrast to large-scale industrial farming practices that exist. And Amanda, I don't know if you'd like to speak to some of the contrasts that you've seen personally in terms of agricultural practices in somewhere like the Pacific, in contrast to agricultural practices in Australia, for example.
Absolutely, and I guess even beyond that, the work I've done a lot of work in Southeast Asia as well. So it's really interesting kind of looking at the different types of agriculture, dependent on the number of the population and the spread and the open space. But I guess in the Pacific, agriculture is the number one contributor for a majority of countries in terms of GDP, and most people contribute to the agricultural sector. It really has the highest potential for social impact. And as I said before, the Pacific, it's a different type of farming. There's a lot of high quality niche products that take a lot longer to produce. You produce in smaller quantities, but they're higher end products. Things like coffee, cocoa, some of Pacific vanilla is world class. Coconut oils, the products like ginger and turmeric that you were mentioning before, and high quality oils, for example. I guess in terms of practices, they're quite unique. There isn't the industrial type farming that you see in Southeast Asia or in Australia. But what's important is productivity. And then there's a real natural fertility to the land. Everything grows, even weeds. So, weedicide tends to be something that's quite widespread and can be wasteful. So what we've seen is organic farming is really offering a lot of potential for the Pacific. Sustainable agriculture and organic farming can really improve productivity so that so when we look at businesses that have organic certification or eco certification, those that are involved in the fair trade movement, they're really good businesses for investment because, they are working in that practice. In fact, interestingly, the government of Samoa is looking at organic certification for the entire country, which means that anything coming from Samoa would be certified organic, which is, if that happens, would be a major achievement. So I think sustainable agriculture is a really, really interesting and important sector, as well as the impact that it has on men and women.
I think, Leata, you mentioned a new wave of a new generation of entrepreneurs, and we also know that you talked briefly about Vanuatu's Tana Coffee and the investment that took place in that organization. So I'm sure you have some sort of deeper insight into what it takes to really invest in these organizations and what it means for their growth as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think that's the crucial part too, is really, if you take a step back, is that the foundations and the fundamentals of that. And that's what's so vital, the work that the intermediaries such as IIX do, and also the guidance under the Pacific Rise program, because that sort of maps out the future plans and what is sustainable growth for the business, and what type of impact investment would go into be that enabler to have that growth and social, not growth in business, but also growth in social impact. So you can see there, and you can see firsthand, and with Tana, that's, you've got majority of them being women out in the farms out on Tana Island, who are now getting that income that they normally wouldn't have, an opportunity such as like that. And the same goes for the coconut clusters that are in Samoa, where you're seeing more and more women, being able to do the coconut oils, high-end coconut oils, and produce, and it just continues to grow. So it's a space that I think has a lot of opportunity. As Amanda said, it's more on a lot of that niche area, but I think it's just vital looking at Vanuatu Tana Coffee, because that's sort of, it's a proven, demonstrated model of impact investment working in the Pacific region, and there's just such more opportunity for that down the track too, for the likes of Bula, Renandi, and the others that are in the pipeline as well. Yeah,
I mean, I think we're all here because we do believe that the Pacific, it represents a deep investment opportunity from an impact investment perspective, because the impact is so significant, it's so great. Leata, maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about why would investors potentially hesitate from investing in the Pacific? I mean, from a risk perspective, is there anything that you've experienced in terms of talking to investors where there are specific risks that they're thinking about, and is there anything specific that you feel like that the Pacific is not necessarily understood the way that it could be?
Sure, and I think, look, we've had, it's funny because recently I was at the Impact Investment Summit that we had down here in Sydney, and we had talking to a lot of the impact investors, there are concerns, around, the political environments and, what sort of social, what are the environmental risks? It's a tropical area. It can be affected, but I think with any type of investment, there's always an element of risk. And again, I will go back to that work because part of it with any impact investment or any investment to speak is that due diligence and the need to make sure that a lot of the work is done in the intermediary space of being investment ready. And that's where all that work goes into. When we're working with impact investors, I'm speaking to a pool of impact investors now where they've got concerns and, around the risks. And that's the area in the space where we really try and we work towards how do we mitigate these risks and how do we, address those concerns. And from my experience in the last couple that I've worked on, when they look at those concerns and then they have a look at the actual social impact and the measurement of that, it actually sort of balances it back where they say, okay, well, we're concerned with that. We're putting in place those areas to mitigate some of those risks, whether it's, more regular reporting or, shifting it from one side of the island to another island, changing the materials around the build for environmental area risks, and then to actually mitigating those and then having a look at that social impact side. It sort of balances it out, and then they're saying, well, in most cases they shift towards that, having the advantage around that social part.
Yeah, Natasha, I think that brings us to a sort of a interesting point that we know about IIX is that we follow a fairly rigorous approach to impact measurement and communicating that to investors. So do you think that's something that in the Pacific, how vital would that be in terms of communicating that?
No, so that's a good question. And just building off Liata's point, and of course, PTIA has extensive experience doing this as well. I think when it comes to the Pacific, and since we've now spent quite a few years talking to investors about the Pacific, we do have our own network of about 1,000 investors from across the world who we're frequently speaking with about different opportunities in all the 40 geographies we work in. When it comes to the Pacific, I feel it's also a question not just of risk and risk mitigation, but also of risk perception and risk management. And I think there are two solutions that we feel will work quite well for the Pacific. One is impact measurement. And we do think that if you're only talking in terms of risk and return from the purely financial perspective, you lose out on a lot of the value that gets created. Just taking the example of what we've seen in Asia, the 40 deals listed on the Impact Partners equity crowdfunding platform, none of them have failed. And we feel that the reason is because there's such strong social impact that we were able to measure and articulate, that there were also risks that were mitigated. The community itself was empowered. We're not looking at just shareholders, we're looking at all stakeholders. And therefore the longevity of these businesses and their slow but steady performance has allowed them to outlive many other organizations. If you look at a general VC fund, about 2% of the deals work. We see that's very different in the impact investing space. So it is, and it's exemplified for the Pacific, of course, because this is a uncharted territory, which is why webinars such as this are very important, and the work that Pacific Rise is doing to bring more awareness around these issues is also very important. I think this is even more heightened when you talk about gender lens investing, because there's a perceived risk again associated with that, no matter which part of the world you're in. Unfortunately, investing in women is still not fully understood, and therefore it makes impact measurement even more important. And also the second solution being having other stakeholders come in to de-risk these investments so you can tackle these perceived risks. And DFAT did an amazing job of doing that with our first bond that we did, the Women's Livelihood Bond in Asia. So DFAT and USAID, the donor arms of the US government and the Australian government, came together to help us guarantee that bond of 50%. We're in talks to have similar structures in place as we expand the bond series across the world. And I think that kind of participation, that's where we need public sector to come in and say, we'll guarantee mechanisms. That's where we need foundations to come in and say, we'll take the first loss. And when you do this, you can leverage in higher amounts of capital from these private sector investors, tackle risk, and also make sure you're measuring and articulating the social value of these investment opportunities that will, over the long term, also further reduce the risk.
Thanks, Natasha. I'd like to sort of start the Q&A discussion today. We've received a number of questions online already from you, from the participants that we have already, who've mentioned, and I think a list of about 20 questions. I'd like to throw the first one to Amanda, and it was one of the questions that we had planned to discuss in the panel in any case, which is really what does the Pacific look like 10 years from now? Why is this the right time to look at investment opportunities in the Pacific? And Amanda, if you could maybe speak to what you see, at least in terms of Pacific Rise, where does the Pacific go, and what does it look like 10 years from now?
Thank you very much, and that's something I would love to talk about. And I think it's, I guess, putting it in a bit of context, and a couple of the questions were about things like exit options, timeframes, and things. Impact investment really doesn't exist in the Pacific yet. So it's a very nascent environment, which is why you've got programs like Pacific Rise coming in to provide that subsidy, to provide, research around legal and regulatory frameworks to look at what Pacific governments can do to foster that market. So our role really is demonstration. So we are funding to see what an impact investment looks like. So certainly they are very variable and can depend on what is the investment or the type of capital. But so when we started, we talked to a lot of investors about what would make them invest in the region. And I think, for them, seeing case studies, seeing the tangibility of what an investment looks like, what the timeframes look like, what the exits look like, are the things that investors are looking for. There are the brave ones that might jump in, and there are investors already looking and starting to invest, but a majority of them are taking that look and see. So, Liada and Natasha talked about a lot of that risk perception, the fragmentation, the small scale, the distance, climate change was something that is kind of front of mind for a lot of investors. But as Pranay was saying, these are the risks of today, and investments aren't exited today, they are realized in the future. So when we wanted to, I guess, engage with investors about that future. So we posed a question: what would the Pacific look like in 15 years' time? And we asked this question to our Pacific networks, to researchers, to investors, to UN agencies. And luckily at the time, the World Bank had recently completed a series of ideas around Pacific Possible, looking at different sectors and a sort of 20-25 year time frame. So using this data and trends, we created our Pacific investment thesis, which is that hopeful vision of the future. And we partnered really closely with our with the Criterion Institute to do that, presenting those different futures, climate change adaptation, the high quality value chains. For example, if you look at the cocoa industry, we know there's a global shortage of cocoa predicted. So if you're investing today to take into account that global shortage, then you've already kind of got an opportunity, even if it's small scale, to realize an investment. Informal economy is a big one, and I think most of the organizations we work with, the businesses that they are partnering or looking at investment for, cross into that informal economy, and globally the informal economy is worth billions. So what is it that investors can do to think outside the box and get capital into that informal economy? Technology and transportation, the Pacific, there's a lot of investment going into increasing access to high-speed internet. What does that mean for businesses? So really, when you're at that early stage, there are a whole lot of possibilities. We also used a gender lens across each of those futures and also, as I was saying before, there's a whole lot of other capital flow into the region, and what is it that capital can do to reinforce those futures? Now, we use this investment thesis. It is up on our website, and it's an and it's an engagement tool. So it's a useful exercise for us to profile the region in a way to really engage with investors' imaginations, and to think differently about what the Pacific could look like.
Thanks, Amanda. I think that's absolutely fascinating. It's when we were in the Pacific, I think we always think about what development will look like. What kind of development will it be, and how will that change the landscape of the socio-economic environment that exists, because it's so unique. And I think that's really interesting. That's a really interesting way of looking at it. We've had a lot of questions. Unfortunately, we really don't have time to take them all. We'll do at least one more, if not two. But there's a couple of questions that I wanted to highlight. One is on sustainable agriculture and the demographics of the market, and if there are opportunities for the local market, not just export. So, Liata, I don't know if you'd like to speak to that. What does sustainable agriculture look like from a local market perspective, and what are the demographics associated with the Pacific?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think that it's quite varied and it's all very different. So I think too, when you say these 16 Pacific Islands, or they're all very unique in themselves. Fiji is very different to Samoa. Samoa is very different to Solomons. And each of them too have a different focus. And for sustainable agriculture, there is some need for assistance in terms of helping them become more sustainable, because a lot of them at the moment, and I know Amanda touched on how there's going to be a cocoa shortage and so forth. How do they, mitigate the issues around that? It's not just about export. It's also there's a focus on domestic as well. And we're working with enterprise at the moment that's in Solomons that's really just trying to meet their domestic demand and the products that they're working with, and that's fine, because again, it still makes them suitable potential for an impact investment, because they have a massive social impact across the islands that again otherwise wouldn't have access to that sort of income. And have that impact. So, and just in short, I know we're running out of time, is that the demographics are very different across the Pacific Islands. It's not just about export. We do have enterprises that are just focused on how they can grow their businesses to just be able to meet their domestic demand as well.
Thanks, Liata. I would agree. It is, and I apologize in case we are sort of clubbing together the Pacific Islands as a whole, because they, as you said, they are all so unique and different, and the local conditions are different in every country. One of the interesting things about particularly the island nations, I think, is that they can produce so much, because as we've been talking about, there is such fertility of land in a sense, and also the sea. So there is the opportunity to really bring some value from export markets as well. And I think that's what we're looking at as an opportunity from an investment standpoint, is to bring some of that value to the local communities by recognizing higher price points for things like organic and wild, particularly commodities. So in a sense, I think that's the opportunity that exists from an investment standpoint. I'd like to wrap up with the last question, to just talk about one of the questions that we received, which is what are the key development areas to make organizations investment ready? I'll club it with one of the other questions that we've had on impact assessment methodology. Natasha, if you could just maybe speak to those.
Yes, so very briefly, I think, just in the interest of time, and I'd love to have the other panelists also jump in. I'll just focus on one point in the context of what we saw in Fiji when we were doing an accelerator last year, again, in partnership with Pacific Rise and PTI. The accelerator, of course, when you ask a question like 3 to 5 development areas, I think it will vary based on the stage of growth the social enterprise is at. Seed stage organizations had very different needs from growth stage organizations. However, the one common thread that I saw was the need for better impact assessment tools. So briefly speaking to the way we do our methodology, which I know was another question asked, we focus on we're different in three ways. So our proprietary methodology, the IX Sustainability Pyramid, looks at outcomes, not outputs. So while number of women we impact is interesting, how we impact them is even more interesting, whether we're improving productivity, financial resilience, and so on and so forth. So measuring those outcomes, not outputs. The second is we do it in a forward-looking way. Investors are not philanthropic funders. They're not looking for retrospective analysis on how the impact was created. They want to know, if they give you $1 million today, what are they going to achieve looking forward? So we do forward-looking projections. And the third, which is in line with the forward-looking projections, is just as you do a DCF for the financial to project the financial return someone will get, we do that for the social returns, and we link them to the capital that will be mobilized, which helps us reduce the risk of mission drift. Within our framework, we also use the IRIS metrics. We were part of the group who actually developed this with Jin. This is sort of the general ledger of the impact investing world. And we also link them to the Sustainable Development Goals. We're on the advisory, our founder is on the advisory board for both UNDP and UNSCAP. So we have very good relations with the UN, and we also make it a point of focusing heavily on SDG 5, gender equity, across all our impact measurement. And I think that's a key development point that we should give higher importance to, regardless of the stage of growth any organization is at.
Thanks, Natasha. I think that was a good way to sort of wrap up the webinar. We thank you all for taking the time to participate in the webinar today. And thank you in particular to all of the panelists, Amanda, Liata, and Natasha, for an extremely engaging discussion. And I hope that these conversations continue offline, and that each of you is available to answer a number of the questions which unfortunately we've not had the time to go through. Thank you also to Pacific Rise for the support that they've offered for putting together this webinar. And if you are, and also the Australian government, if you are an accredited investor that is looking to invest in either Bula Coffee or Anandi, and you'd like more information, you'd like to consider it, or if you're a social enterprise that is looking to raise investment, do feel free to reach out to us at impactpartners@ixglobal.com. Thank you all for the webinar today, and thanks everyone.
Thanks, Pranay.
Thanks, Pranay.
Thank you.